Virginia cannabis arrests are still happening, even though many people believe cannabis is legal here. And that belief, is exactly where the problem starts. Because on paper, the law looks permissive. But in practice, well, this is where enforcement changes the outcome. And later in this video, I'm going to return to one specific legal distinction that quietly determines whether an encounter ends with a warning or an arrest. Here's the counterintuitive legal fact or misconception. Most Virginians assume that if cannabis is legal to possess in some form, arrest should be off the table. That assumption feels reasonable. It is logical. But Virginia cannabis arrests don't happen because people ignore the law outright. They happen because the law is applied through enforcement standards that look nothing like the headline version people remember. And that difference, between what the law says and how it's enforced, creates outcomes that surprise people later. A wide shot of a quiet city street in Norfolk, early morning, patrol car parked but empty. Let's challenge a belief right now. If you believe cannabis arrests in Virginia are rare, outdated, or the result of obvious violations, I want you to hold on to that belief for just a moment. Because the cases that continue to move through courts don't usually start with someone trying to break the law. They start with someone who thought they were already compliant. That's the gap we're going to walk through today. Welcome to Norfolk, Virginia Cannabis Hub, where we focus on Virginia-specific cannabis law, local governance, and regulatory clarity, so residents, business owners, and communities understand what the law actually says, not just what headlines suggest. Today we're talking about Virginia cannabis arrests, why they still occur, and why legality on the surface doesn't always protect people during enforcement. This is not a discussion about cannabis use, sales, or cultivation. It's a legal analysis, what the statutes say, how enforcement works, and where outcomes quietly diverge. Here's the context. Virginia's cannabis framework didn't evolve all at once. It arrived in layers: decriminalization, limited legalization, medical allowances, each with its own enforcement logic. And that layered approach left gaps. Regulatory silence in some areas. Discretion in others. That's why confusion is common. The law didn't fail to explain itself, it just didn't explain how it would be applied. Here's the legal explanation. At a surface level, Virginia law reduced penalties for possession and allowed limited personal possession under defined conditions. That part is accurate. Legally true, yet operationally misleading. Because enforcement doesn't stop at possession alone. Officers evaluate context, evidence, location, and classification. And those evaluations aren't chemistry tests or labels. They're legal judgments made in real time. More accurately, the statute sets boundaries, but enforcement decides which boundary matters. This is where most people stop learning. And where problems start. How enforcement works. Virginia cannabis arrests typically begin with something else. A traffic stop. A complaint. A workplace issue. Enforcement doesn't require intent, it requires probable cause and interpretation. Lab reports are not determinative at the roadside. Packaging doesn't control outcomes. And discretion plays a quiet but decisive role in whether an incident escalates. And before we get to who this affects, there's another layer, because enforcement outcomes don't end at arrest. Who this affects. Consumers are affected when assumptions about legality don't match enforcement thresholds. Retailers, especially hemp-adjacent businesses, are affected when classification standards shift faster than guidance. Local governments are affected when state law creates discretion without uniform application. And within the medical cannabis framework, patients and caregivers can find themselves navigating parallel systems that don't always align cleanly. Each group interacts with the law differently, and that difference matters. Why this matters? Virginia cannabis arrests carry consequences beyond courtrooms. Employment reviews. Housing applications. Licensing disclosures. Even when charges don't stick, the record of enforcement often does. This isn't about fear. It's about inevitability. This is where cases turn. This is where outcomes diverge. A dim interior shot of an empty office. Now, this is the point where most explanations stop. But this is also where the most important clarification begins. Because understanding why Virginia cannabis arrests still happen requires shifting focus from legality to application. And that brings us back to the issue I mentioned earlier. Here's a scenario. Earlier I mentioned a legal distinction that quietly determines outcomes. Now let's return to that. Imagine a late afternoon in Virginia. Nothing dramatic. Just a regular day winding down. Two people, separate encounters, same city, same amount, same substance, same statute sitting on the books. On paper, these situations are identical. But they don't end the same way. In the first scenario, the interaction begins with a routine stop. The officer asks a few questions. There's no allegation of distribution, no immediate safety concern. The substance is acknowledged, noted, and evaluated within a civil framework. The encounter stays administrative. Documentation is minimal. The individual leaves. No arrest. In the second scenario, the stop begins the same way. Same amount. Same location. Same legal baseline. But this time, classification shifts during the interaction. Not because of chemistry. Not because the substance changed. But because the enforcement lens changes. The question becomes not what the substance is, but how it's being interpreted under a different statutory standard. At that moment, the encounter crosses a procedural line. Now the officer's role changes. The evidentiary standard changes. The burden moves. And the same facts that produced no arrest minutes earlier, now support criminal procedure. This is where people are surprised later. Because nothing illegal was added. Nothing new occurred. The law didn't change mid-conversation. Only the interpretation did. And this is how Virginia cannabis arrests continue to happen. Not through contradiction. Not through loopholes. But through conditional legality, where outcomes depend less on the rule itself and more on which rule is being applied. Here's what to watch next. This raises a new question, one that doesn't get asked often enough. How does federal land, employment policy, or housing authority change enforcement outcomes even when state law appears settled? That's where we're headed next. Here's a question to think about. If legality depends on interpretation, who actually controls your risk, the statute, or the system applying it? If you've experienced confusion around Virginia cannabis arrests, or you want to see a specific enforcement issue broken down next, share it respectfully in the comments. Like, subscribe, and join the Norfolk City Cannabis Community for deeper, citation-based discussion, because knowing the rule is not the same as avoiding the consequence.